To continue with a related topic today, which is scalability of throughput in terms of number of transactions in a POW blockchain. So this topic is related to the topic of scaling up computation, but it's not exactly the same. So let's see why. So there's a difference between having a block, let's say, which is very large in size and the number of transactions being high. Okay, this is one, let's say this is one block. And it's different to having a block with a few transactions but with high gas. Okay, so this could be a situation where, let's say, we have some CITs. Okay, and it's a bit different from this case where let's say all the transactions are just payment transactions, A paying B sort of transactions, but just the number of these transactions is very high. So why is so we might think, why is it so different? I mean, because the total gas might be the same, right? So let's take as an example Tuxedo, let's say. So we know how Tuxedo works for this situation, and we showed how it works and so on. But does Tuxedo work with this first case? So suppose you have a large block, very large in size because it's packed with a number of transactions, let's say thousands and thousands of transactions, each let's say which is doing a payment, and the gas for each is low. So none of these are CITs. So what does Tuxedo do? So we said that Tuxedo is going to delay the execution of these transactions. Right? So suppose this block is received. So Tuxedo delays the transactions, delay the execution. But we said that this doesn't completely work because there are certain attacks possible. So you have to collect the fees, collect gas fees. And at least in this case, we saw how that was straightforward. There are a few number of transactions. So the collection of gas fees required very little computation, and the heavy computation of the CITs were delayed. Right? So even though this block was received here, we were able to get things work out, right? I mean, assuming of course the block was of this type. But suppose the block is of this type, then the collection of gas fees is going to take a lot of time. It's going to might be as much as actually executing all these transactions, because the gas payment is itself going to involve computation the same as one of these. Okay. So this is non-trivial. Computation if transactions are of the non-CIT nature, right? They are the simple transactions of payment. So Tuxedo would work in this case where you have few transactions with very high gas, right? But it doesn't work here in this sort of a situation, because the gas collection itself, the initial fee collection which you have to do, is going to take a lot of time, and then again you are hit with the verifier's dilemma, right? So this is just to illustrate why the two situations are not the same, right? And maybe some modification of Tuxedo might do the job. Maybe one of you might come up with an idea for that, right? But at least Tuxedo itself doesn't work like that. With my students, we've discussed this issue and it may be possible to maybe tweak Tuxedo to get this to work, right? But it would require a lot of additional work. So today I wanted to focus on this issue, just about increasing transaction throughput. So instead of let's say a Bitcoin block having a few transactions, can we increase the number of transactions, let's say 10 times or 100 times and so on, right? And that's what we really want in a global payment system. Okay, so is that possible? Can we have large blocks? So of course we know that we are going to have some sort of a verifier's dilemma problem over here, because just validating the block is going to take a lot of time. This creates the verifier's dilemma. Okay, so suppose we stick to the Bitcoin rules. Or even the Ethereum rules. Okay, so this is one problem which we studied in depth. So what else could be an issue? So there's another issue that related to security. And this is because the propagation time goes up. So why is there? So suppose, why is this true? Well, suppose this is miner 1 and he forwards let's say a massive block to miner 2, who forwards this to miner 3. Right? Now each time the miner forwards it to the next one, he has to verify the block. So the propagation time goes up with the block size. Okay? And because network propagation goes up, that leads to a higher chance of forking. And people have done extensive analysis. We might look at that a little bit later in the course. But one of the quantities that people look at is the ratio of, let's say, the interarrival time between blocks to ratio of this quantity to the network propagation time of a block. And you might think, what is it for Bitcoin? Okay, so for Bitcoin, we know that it is 10 minutes, so it's 600 seconds. This is just, and of course it's different for Ethereum. And what is the propagation time for a block? So we want to look at the whole network, and we want to say, suppose one miner generates a block and forwards it and so on. And that roughly comes out to be 10 seconds for a 1 MB block. Okay, so this is 60, right? And this really decides in some way the security of, it's a parameter related to how secure the blockchain is, right? If this number is smaller, then the chain becomes less secure, right? Because, and the analysis of course is a little bit involved because you have to consider all types of attacks. And you know, of course, clearly the forking, the more forks there are, you can imagine that it's easier for an attacker to launch more attacks, right? Because essentially when you have a fork, you're dividing the hashing power of honest people between multiple chains. And you know, and for example, one of these gets orphaned. Suppose these are all honest blocks, this one would get orphaned, and it would not add to the weight of the longest chain created by the honest miners, right? So anyway, the analysis is a little bit advanced, and maybe later in the course we look at it. But one of the parameters is this quantity C, and you want C to be as large as possible, right, for more security. And maybe if you want to redesign a system, you would want to at least keep this C, let's say, fixed to a particular pre-decided value so that you don't make the system less secure. Okay, so it's around, C is roughly 60 for Bitcoin, but if you increase the block size, then the C is going to go down. So if I increase the block size, keeping inter-arrival time of blocks constant, then that would mean C decreases, which leads to less security. Okay, so just increasing the block size in Bitcoin has various issues. Besides the various verifier's dilemma, we also have to deal with a less secure system. And of course, there are other issues which miners face of their own, you know, but that is not something that we are going to consider in this particular lecture. But miners have in general opposed increasing block size, just because increasing block size means more number of, let's say, UTXOs in the blockchain system, which means you need to have more memory, for example, to verify, validate blocks quickly and so on, right? Which miners don't want, okay, just to keep the costs low. Okay, but that's a separate issue. So these are some, what I've shown over here are a couple of issues that we need to consider. Okay, so what is the solution to this? You know, so ideally we would like to increase the throughput, but without compromising much on security. Okay? So there's a paper which I wanted to talk about today, which is called Bitcoin NG. NG, you can say, for next generation, and this came out in 2016 in NSDI, one of the well-known conferences, and this was published by Itay Eyal and others. One of them is a person called Gun Sirer. He's a professor at Cornell. Okay. So their idea was interesting, and of course every idea, when we deviate from Satoshi, it looks very clever, that we might think, why didn't Satoshi think of it, because he was so smart, right? So but of course when you deviate from Satoshi's ideas, you run into trouble, like even with Tuxedo, right? We changed the rule a little bit, but then we had to deal with various sorts of attacks and so on, right, which may not have been there, let's say, in Satoshi's system. So what are these guy is going to do. So what does Satoshi's Bitcoin do? So Satoshi solved too many things in one shot. So he creates a block So a block has proof of work, plus it has ordered transactions. Okay, so and once the proof of work has been generated, the transactions are locked in. Satoshi did that very well. So of course he has a header here, and of course there's a Merkle root, and there are transactions over here. So once the POW is found for this particular block header, these transactions are locked because you can't change them at all because of the Merkle root there in the block header. Right? So these transactions are completely perfectly ordered. Nobody can change the ordering. Right? A very elegant system. So what Bitcoin NG tries to do, what Eyal and others try to do, is that they wanted to separate these out. And once you see the initial idea, you will go wow, but once you look a little bit into the analysis, you will realize that there could be some pitfalls which Satoshi of course avoids. Okay? So what are they going to do? And we'll see that other people of course are going to exploit this idea in later papers. This came out several years back. Okay. So let's look at this Bitcoin NG idea. So Bitcoin NG has two types of blocks, something called key blocks and what they call micro blocks. So what is a key block? So this has POW but no transactions except, let's say, the Coinbase. And here you have no POW but with transactions. So how does this work? What does a miner do? So a miner creates a header and there is only one transaction here. Let's say there is a Coinbase in here and he tries to do POW. Okay, so it's an empty block that he is creating and he's just going to do POW here, and once he solves the POW he broadcasts. So that's good enough, and let's say that this is the chain that we have. So what happens is you have a key block. Let's say this one is sent and it is added to the end of the chain over here. Okay, so what is the advantage of this? Because this has no transactions, it is small in size it's validated fast, and the propagation time is also fast, network propagation time. Okay, so let's say Satoshi's 1 MB block might take 10 seconds to propagate through the network, but the key block might take 1 or 2 seconds, let's say, because all you have to check is whether the proof of work is correct and so on. So these key blocks move very fast in the network. Okay. So potentially you can place these key blocks much lower for having the same C value. Okay, so let's say C for is equal to 60 for Bitcoin. For 1 MB block. And for Bitcoin NG, let's say for key blocks, you can have the interarrival time much smaller. Okay, so let's say suppose you have suppose propagation delay is 1 second, or let's say 2 seconds. Suppose you want to have 60, you want to maintain the security. So then what would you have over here? So you have 2 in the denominator, which is the network propagation delay. So if we wanted to keep C60 over here for Bitcoin NG, and we had a reduced network propagation delay of 2 seconds compared to 10 seconds over here, we could also reduce the interarrival time, let's say to 120 compared to 600 seconds. So we could be generating these key blocks, let's say at a rate much higher than the rate of Bitcoin for the same security. Okay, so I'm assuming this, and of course this would actually have to be measured in the Bitcoin network in practice, right? So some experiments with my students show that roughly indeed this is true, that block headers propagate much faster, at least a factor of 5 faster than a 1 MB block. Okay. So what does this mean for the same security as Bitcoin? Okay, I'm assuming that roughly this ratio tells us something about the security of the system. Bitcoin NG can generate key blocks much faster, at a much faster rate. And here we are saying you can generate one key block every 2 minutes, and the system is as secure as Bitcoin. Okay, for things like double spend attack, selfish mining, and so on. Okay. So this is great, but where do the transactions come in? So these key blocks only have proof of work, and that's where we have to talk about the second type of blocks, which are called micro blocks. So how is this generated? Suppose you have some miners, let's say A and B, right? So suppose this is the chain and A generates a key block. Now what Bitcoin NG allows is that this miner A can start generating the micro blocks pointing to the previous one and so on. So the first micro block, all these are all generated by A. And what happens then? So these don't contain, these are just blocks with transactions, and of course they have to be signed with the public key of A. So this contains the public key of A, and these are of course signed by the, let's say, the secret key of A. I'll just strike this out. I'll just call it PK. So everybody knows these are generated by A, and A can generate any number of these. So he keeps generating. And so what is B supposed to do? B is supposed to validate these blocks, validate the transactions, and then he is going to mine on the last validated block he has seen. So suppose B is honest. So these are called micro blocks. So B mines on latest validated micro block created by A. Right, so see how this is occurring. Unlike Satoshi's where the transactions are in the block, here there is only a key block with POW, and then one after the other A keeps generating his micro blocks. So right, so B has validated this one, he tries to mine a key block on this and so on, then he sees this, he validates it and so on, and then finally let's say that B is the winner here. Of course it could be anyone. A2 could generate the next key block, but let's say that B wins over here. And now this stops the process of this micro block generation, right? And now B generates his micro blocks with transactions. Okay, so this is Bitcoin NG, what Bitcoin NG does, and it looks terrific because not only can you space these closer to each other, the key blocks could be, let's say, only 2 minutes apart, right? But you might want to think how many transactions can you have here, right? So we said that in Satoshi's case you had like a 1 MB block, but how many can you have over here? How many transactions can you put in? And it turns out that, well, as fast as somebody can validate these particular micro blocks, I mean, you can generate these as fast as you can, right? So A is, let's say, batching up transactions into blocks. Let's say that these are not 1 MB blocks, let's say that it's a smaller block, 100K or whatever. He can keep generating them one after the other and sending them out at the line rate, right? Whatever is his processing rate. Okay. So these can be generated, let's say, as fast as A can create them. Okay, so he's putting them together, validating these. Let's say that these are small blocks, which is why they're called micro blocks. So you want to keep the propagation time low. I mean, so that everybody sort of gets to see them quickly. Just as an exercise, you might think, what if I have a very large micro block? Okay, the problem with that is it would take a long time to propagate, and this key block might be generated before the micro block even reaches B, right? So you want to avoid that. You want to split it up into smaller. You want to split these into smaller blocks, which is why they're called micro blocks. So each of them could be, let's say, 100 kb or 10 kb or whatever, right? But they are being generated very fast, and each microblock, subsequent one, points the previous one to form a blockchain like this. Okay? And everybody is able to validate these blocks also at the at the same rate, let's say, at which A is generating them, right? And so this is the block structure that we end up. Okay. So fine. So the throughput is very high. What have we achieved? High throughput. Okay, so as, let's say, as fast as a miner's CPU can process transactions. Right? And of course, we have done this all without encountering any verifier's dilemma or anything like that. These transactions are not really in the block. So what does B do? B first doesn't see any microblocks, so B initially, of course, B is going to try to mine on this, but then he sees this one, and so then he tries to mine here. He validates this, he tries to mine, and so on, right? So he doesn't have to worry. So suppose A generates a large string of microblocks here which B is not able to process. That still is not a problem for him, because he just has to mine on the last validated microblock which he has seen, and he's fine. Okay, it's not the strict verifier's dilemma where it's you either validate the block and mine on it, or you're in trouble. That dilemma is not over there. Okay. So and of course, if A generates this slow enough that everybody else can validate, then he's fine. Even all his microblocks might get included, and the next key block will point to the last microblock which he has generated. Okay. So we have achieved high throughput over here, and we have avoided the verifier's dilemma. Okay, so that's fantastic. I mean, we've solved the problem, right? But clearly, after so many years, nobody is really using Bitcoin NG. I mean, it's not out there in any blockchain. So what is the reason? I mean, of course, there are some issues discussed in the paper, and we'll have to talk about those. Okay, so what can go wrong over here? So we have to worry about the situation where these miners may not be perfectly honest. Okay, so let's think about it. What can go wrong? Okay, so maybe before this I should also say, what we talked about is that you can, let's say you can have 6 confirmations faster, okay, since let's say 6 key blocks are generated in much less time than 1 hour, which is the situation for Bitcoin. Okay, for the same value of C. Okay, so let's talk about what can go wrong. So there's a problem with the disconnecting the proof of work with the ordering of transactions. Okay. So suppose this is a key block of A, and A starts generating these micro blocks. There is some transaction fee over here of these transactions, because I mean, why should A include a transaction if it doesn't offer him some fee, right? So these transactions get put in over here, and let's see, so these are all going to A. So B is mining, and B of course has to follow the heaviest chain protocol. So B has to mine on, suppose there is some chain over here. This suppose is the heaviest chain that B sees. So B mines on this. So what is the incentive of B to mine on any of these blocks? Because there is no POW. So if there is no POW, then I mean, it doesn't affect him whether he is mining on this one or this one. I mean, he's still mining, both are sort of equivalent in terms of POW weight of the chain. But there is an advantage to mine on this rather than this one. And the advantage is that if B succeeds in mining a block here, so suppose he creates a key block here, B could include all these transactions in his own micro block. And here B gets all the fees. So this is a serious issue, because if everybody is like B, suppose C also is as malicious as B, so C might create a key block here. Another miner, let's say, is the next winner, and he tries to put all the transactions in his own micro blocks. So all of these are greedy miners. So what do we end up with? We end up with a chain of only key blocks. All the transactions are left out because each of them is greedy and wants to put all the transactions in his own micro block so that he gets all the fees. Right? So this is essentially, it's a chain without any liveness, because even though you're creating key blocks, there are no transactions getting in. Okay. So this is a major issue. And of course, it's pointed out, the problem is pointed out in the paper itself. So what do we do here? I mean, it seems that we are stuck, right? So this particular protocol is not going to work. Right? Because if everybody is, let's say, greedy, then we're going to get a chain with no transactions in it. Okay. So what is the solution? So of course, what they said is that you actually split the transaction fees between A and the person who is going to mine next. So the next key block miner. And how should you split it? You might want to think, should you give 60% to A and 40% to the next guy? Well, that seems a bit of a problem, because if somebody realizes that, let's say, B is trying to mine, and he realizes that if he includes these transactions in his own micro blocks, then he's going to get 60%, then he might do the same thing here. So what we want to do is, let's say you give 40% to A and 60% to B. Okay, so this might be one thing you want to do. So there's definitely a split which is proposed by the authors. Okay, but we have to consider really what the exact split should be, because it depends on so many issues, right? It might depend on how much hashing power this other miner has, right? Suppose with very high probability he's going to create the next key block, he might have a particular behavior, whereas if the chances of his generating the next block are small, maybe he will do something else, right? So it depends on the hashing power of the various miners and so on. Okay. So the authors actually are going to do some analysis, interesting analysis in their paper. Okay. And let's look at some of the analysis that they do. So what should the split be? Intuitively, we know that you want to give the miner less than 50% of the mining fee, which seems a little bit weird, because in Bitcoin the miner gets 100% of the transaction fee, whereas here you're giving him less than 50%. Okay. So let's look at a particular attack, and let's say that this is a key block generated by A, and these are micro blocks of A. So for B, this is one option. To try to mine a key block here. Let's just call this let's suppose this is block B0. Let's just call this block B1. Let's say this is one strategy, and let's say another strategy is for him to try to mine over here. And we're going to say that suppose B has alpha hashing fraction. Okay. And suppose that the reward that we are going to give, let's say this particular one, A is going to be, let's say that the split is going to be gamma to microblock creator and 1 minus gamma to the next miner. So we are going to assume that only B is malicious. And let's say A is honest. So what is going to happen over here? Okay, so what should B do? Let's say we've given it only two options. One is to mine directly on the key block, and one is to mine on the, let's say, the last validated micro block of A. Okay. So let's look at the expected reward in both cases. For B. So suppose B mines over here, what are the chances of his creating the next block? Well, the chances of his creating the next block is alpha, and the he's going to get 1 minus gamma of the phi. Right, and of course everything that I'm mentioning here is going to have to be multiplied by what are the fees are. Okay, so this is the let's say this is the expected reward in terms of the fraction of phi to be 1. So this is for honest behavior. Okay, so this is strategy 1. What if he is dishonest? What if he tries to mine on this directly? Okay, so we might think what is the chances of his creating this block are alpha, and he would include all these transactions over here in his own micro blocks. So he would get a larger, let's say a particular fraction of the fees over here. So his chances of his creating B1, so this is the probability of creating B1 dash. So this is the probability of creating B1. And what is he going to get here? Well, he's going to get the gamma of fraction of the transaction fees, because they are going to be in his micro block. Okay. But it's also possible that he is going to be able to create this block himself also. So this is another key block, and this is also created by B. Okay. Okay, so this is probability of creating B1, and he gets the fees, fraction of the fees gamma for himself. Plus there is a chance that he creates the next block, in which case he gets the entire transaction fees for the micro blocks in between, right? So we are only focusing on the transaction fees of these blocks, and we are just looking at and we are talking earlier about the transaction fees which A has put in his own micro blocks. Okay? Let's say fraction of transaction fee of A's micro blocks. Okay. And of course here he gets 1 minus gamma of the fees, right? And right, so this is what the winnings are going to be. Okay. So which strategy is going to be better? Okay, so what we want the honest strategy to be better. So we want this malicious behavior to be less rewarding. So we want alpha times gamma plus alpha times 1 minus gamma to be less than 1 minus gamma times alpha. Okay, so actually the analysis is a little bit different. I've forgotten something. okay, so for this analysis, so it makes sense to look at B2 only if B1 was indeed created by B. Okay, so I have to put it this way. Okay, otherwise, I mean, the analysis will go, I mean, you would find a trivial situation, right? So in the malicious case, we are assuming that B1 is created by the malicious miner B, in which case he is guaranteed to get gamma because he puts all the transactions in his own microblock. Plus there is a chance of his creating the next block also, and he gets the fee which is meant for the next miner who creates the key block, which is pointing to those microblocks. Okay, so what is this? So alpha of course get cancelled. So what we end up with is something like this. Okay, so gamma plus alpha times 1 minus gamma is less than 1 minus gamma, right? And so what do we have here? So we have we have to solve it in terms of gamma and alpha, and we end up with, after some manipulations, we end up with 1 minus alpha by 2 minus alpha. Okay. So this is one criterion that we have, and so it's saying that depending on how much hashing power the malicious miner has, you have to set the reward appropriately. So this means, so suppose we say that all malicious miners have less than 1/4 of the hashing power. Okay, so suppose we do that. Okay, right? I mean, clearly, if we see that if alpha is larger, then this reward has to become smaller and smaller, which makes the system, I mean, less meaningful. And because you want to give a miner a decent amount of reward for any microblocks that he creates, right? So suppose alpha is less than 0.25. Then what we have is that gamma must be less than 0.43. Okay, and of course if alpha becomes all the way up to 1, then gamma becomes 0, right? And we don't want that, right? So we are already restricting ourselves. We don't want any single miner to have too much of the hashing power, because otherwise we are going to be in we're going to have to give very little reward to the person who's creating the microblocks. Okay, so this is analyzing one particular attack. So what about other attacks which might be possible? And there may be a whole plethora of attacks, but the authors look at another particular attack where A is malicious and let's say the others are honest. So A has created this key block, and let's say A has created some micro blocks. So others are mining on this. But now what is going to happen? So now what is the attack that A is going to do? Others are honest, but A is mischievous. So let's say he has a particular high valued transaction which which he puts in this block, and this is kept secret. So what I mean here is that there is a high fee to be paid here, right? So suppose Bill Gates or somebody, right, has created this transaction, and he has put, let's say, broadcast this transaction, but A wants a big fraction of this, so he puts it in his block over here. Okay, so this high value transaction is put over here, and what really is the attack? Well, really the goal of A is to create this key block himself. So that he gets 100% of the fee. Okay, so suppose he had released this block. So these are all secret. If he had released this block, then maybe somebody else would create a key block, and he would somebody else would create a key block on this and get 1 minus gamma fraction of this transaction fee. Whereas in this particular case, he is going to get the entire transaction fee. Okay, so what is the strategy? Should he release the block or should he not, right? So those are the two options. Okay, so let's see what should he be doing. So suppose he releases the block, then at least, since everybody else is honest, at least he gets gamma fraction of the fees, right? Whereas if he's malicious over here, he might get 100%, but he may also get 0. That might be possible. Or if the next person includes this particular transaction in his own micro blocks, then A might get some of the fee. Okay, so what should he be doing? Okay, so let's see. So suppose he is honest. Then what are the chances that he gets, let's say, this particular transaction fee? So we are only focusing on the transaction fee for this single transaction. Suppose A is honest, then he's definitely going to get gamma of the transaction fee. Okay, so he's definitely going to get this. And let's say that A has alpha fraction of hashing power. So what are the chances that he also creates the next block and gets the full amount? Well, it is alpha times 1 minus gamma times the transaction fee. Okay, so this is his expected reward. I believe this term was missing in the paper, the second term. You can just check it out. Okay. So what about dishonest behavior? So suppose he is malicious, then the chances are that he might create the next block, let's say, before anybody else creates a block. So let me label these blocks so that it's not let's call this B0 and let's call this B1. So A creates B1 and releases his full chain. Up to B1. Right? And then he gets the entire phi or there's a chance, of course, that he doesn't create this B1. The others win. So let's say everybody shifts to that other block, right, created by other people. So I mean that these others win, they create a block, and so the others will of course include, suppose they create a block like this, they would have a block with that particular transaction, high value transaction. But there's a chance that on this A is able to create a block. Okay, so with a certain probability, let's call this B2, let's say. So this is the probability he creates B2. And what is the phi that he gets? Well, he gets 1 minus gamma of the phi, because gamma fraction goes to whoever created this one, this particular key block, and he gets 1 minus gamma. Okay. So now we want the honest reward to be greater than the reward that you get for malicious behavior. Okay. So on simplifying, so we want alpha plus alpha times 1 minus alpha times 1 minus gamma to be less than the honest reward, which is alpha times 1 minus gamma plus gamma, right? And just simplifying, so this means that let's see, so we have alpha to be less than okay, so I'm just cancelling out some terms, so we have alpha times 1 minus gamma common over here, right? So I'm just going to cancel out this 1 over here, so we have alpha plus alpha times minus alpha times 1 minus gamma is less than gamma, right? Okay, so this term and this entire term gets cancelled. Okay, and this simplifies to gamma greater than alpha by 1 plus alpha. Because one of the terms was not considered by the authors, they get a much more complicated formula over here. Okay, so so this is gives us another constraint. So previously we said gamma has to be less than something for that first attack, and for the second attack we are saying that gamma has to be greater than something. So if alpha is less than 0.25, then gamma must be greater than 0.2. Okay. So if alpha is less than 0.25, considering both the two attacks, we have this constraint over here, right? Okay, but it's critical that we are considering alpha less than 0.25. So you can show that if alpha increases, then this upper bound of course is going to decrease and this lower bound is going to increase. And you may, for a certain value of alpha, you may actually find that that one of the attacks is going to succeed. Right? So if you want honest behavior always, I mean, you have to assume that alpha is less than some value, and appropriately you have to choose gamma, right? So a 40% choice, which we said earlier, actually works provided that alpha is less than 0.25. But of course we have only considered two particular attacks, and maybe if there's a third attack where the whole thing breaks down, right? I am not aware of that, but there may be so many different types of attacks possible. So this is Bitcoin NG, and it had some very good ideas, and of course other people were trying to build on this, right? So we look at certain other ideas in the next class, and eventually we will talk about a protocol called Prism, which is a more recent protocol which does something much more complicated than this, but we'll see it's a very, very clever ideas in order to reach an optimal performance which is possible. So Prism will claim to have very high throughput like in Bitcoin NG, but at the same time it will be much more secure, right? And that we'll study in a future class.